So thank you for joining us for this conversation with three of our contributors for the transatlantic Muslim Atlantic issue. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists, and they'll have about 10 minutes each to talk about their essays, and we'll follow that with a discussion and then some Q&A. So we have Hassan Mahamdallie, who's a writer and arts consultant, and he was formerly the director of the Muslim Institute and now is a senior editor. We have Zahrah Nesbitt-Ahmed, who's a gender and development research manager, and she's based in Florence. And then we have Amandla Thomas Johnson, who's a journalist, and he's based in Senegal. So their three essays are quite different in tone and style and content, but one thing that seems to really bring them together is investigating ideas of personal resistance and the particularity of their own narrative, not really conforming to mainstream ideas or interpretations, but really pushing and discovering and challenging things for themselves. So I'd like to invite Zahrah to begin by introducing her piece, and we can see how the discussion goes.
Hi, thank you, Salon, and thank you also to the Muslim Institute for inviting me to this session today. I'll kick in and start discussing my essay by starting to say it is an essay in which I chose to use music to trace my parts of my family history, but also to say that the essay that is in the issue is not what I actually initially intended to write about. So this is why music is actually quite central to it, because music is what finally gave me that jolt and idea. Also, interestingly, as Arsalan said, my background is in gender, and I focus a lot on women's rights. And the essay initially was going to look at my grandmother and to tell, because I really enjoy telling stories or personal stories that we haven't necessarily heard, or from, in quote, everyday people, everyday lives, because sometimes it's the more popular people and the popular narratives that you hear. Unfortunately, the essay is not about my grandmother, it's about my maternal and paternal grandfathers. I didn't write about my grandmother. On one hand, I couldn't connect to it, but there was also tragedy and loss that made it hard for me to write that. And one evening, I was just sitting down, listening to music, and I was thinking about my family history, and it just came to me. I didn't know either of my grandfathers. One was Nigerian from the northern part of Nigeria, and the other one was Caribbean from St. Kitts. And they both passed away when both of my parents were teenagers. So I never got to know them. And I was listening to music, and I started wondering what these men would have been like, and particularly in the era that they were in, which would have been the 50s and the 60s. And I just started getting curious about not only them as individuals, but the time in which they would have lived in. What would that have been like? What kind of, and then I went back to what kind of music would have existed in the 50s and 60s in northern Nigeria, and in the 50s and 60s in St. Kitts. And then from thinking about music, I then started thinking about migration, and the way in which through movement and through sounds also culture gets transmitted. And I started just wondering about what kind of sounds did my grandfathers take with them as they moved, whether it was internally in Nigeria. So my paternal grandfather, as is with the Hausa, which is the ethnic group that he is and that I am, there's a lot of migration, and with it there comes music. So I was thinking about traditional Hausa music and what that would have sounded like. And similarly, I started thinking about international migration and with Caribbeans, and how a lot of Caribbean history and culture does get translated or transmitted through music, and thinking about how it is when Caribbeans migrated to the UK in the 50s and 60s, what they brought with them in terms of music, and how it is that that was used to I don't want to say acclimatize, but bring a bit of themselves into the UK. So all of that just started coming together, and I just started writing. And it was also a way through music for me to learn a bit more about the different parts of my history, but also to try and tell, or again through sound, but also to try and tell, for me, stories that I don't feel is I usually read or I usually hear. So for instance, there are a lot of narratives around Windrush, but I don't know, there's definitely no narratives around a young man from St. Kitts that moved to Birmingham in the 50s. He's not a famous man or anything like that. And to kind of get a sense of the type of work, for instance, that he did. So that really is just what the story is. And it's also really interesting because I wrote it probably around this time last year, because I was thinking as I was preparing for this session. And also when I recently shared the essay, I also thought how the way in which different people relate and narrate to things that you don't imagine. So one person described it as ethnomusicology, and I did not think that when I was even writing it. Another person who read it said it transported them to remember their own grandfather who lived in Brooklyn in a Trinidadian neighborhood in the 30s. And that type of music kind of jogged memory. And I then started to think that the way in which a personal story, which you don't think would touch on other people's lives, can begin to start making people think about things that they wouldn't remember. So I'll stop there because I think we had about 10 minutes and go back to your Salon.
Oh, thank you for that. There's a lot of different ways to think of music. Amandla, would you like to go next?
Okay. Thank you very much for having me and for inviting me also to write this essay. Hassan was the one who commissioned it, so I'm very grateful. And Zahrah, of course, thank you very much. So my piece, Return to Al-Mahdi, was really sort of an attempt to make sense of what it feels like to return to Africa. And let me sort of clarify what I mean by return. A couple centuries back, my ancestors were taken from these shores over to the Caribbean. My parents moved from the Caribbean to the UK, where I was born and brought up. And now I live in Africa. And I actually live in the same part of Africa, where at least some of my ancestors were taken from. So that's the Senegambia sort of region. And every now and again, I walk just, it's only a kilometer away, to the point, Zays al-Mahdi, which is the westernmost point in Africa and of the old world. And I sort of have a moment there sometimes just to sort of think and reflect and to imagine sort of what, happened and what could be. And so this essay was kind of framed around those thoughts and sort of those experiences. And I live right on the Atlantic. I mean, it's just literally 5 meters from me right now. You can't see it, but it's right there. And one of the interesting things is that this morning, for example, I saw track some of the ships going past. So this morning there was a Liberian flagged cargo ship going past. But 200 years ago, it could have been a slave ship, And at the moment, I've been given an assignment to write about a recent rush of Senegalese people who have been making it across to the Canary Islands in the hope of getting to the EU. And some of them would have come somewhere along the horizon, where I am as well. So this idea of the the Atlantic, the Black Atlantic, holds a lot of resonance from sort of global capitalism and trade to slavery and to some of the modern forces that are sort of uprooting Africans to get to Europe. So these are some of the sort of themes that I try to explore. I think that as a Black person, a revert, Muslim, someone from the West, someone of Caribbean heritage, living in Africa, it puts me in an interesting sort of position when it comes to sort of various narratives. In that I'm not really fitting into these sort of various categories that seem to be open for me, and so this is quite hard to capture in a sort of linear story. The frames and even the frames of reference aren't really available for me. For instance, the sort of Black past has been erased through slavery, but in the West, Black people continue to face certain forms of violence. Black stories often, or African stories, are often marginal within the wider Muslim sort of sphere. While in the Caribbean, Muslims sort of rub up against what is considered to be a sort of normative Christian identity. And as I mentioned in the essay, in Africa, you know, those of us who are of African descendants of slave heritage aren't really sort of included, at least where I am anyway. And I haven't really thrown in the sort of British or the revert part into that sort of melting pot. So what emerges is a sort of fragmentary story with sort of historical, political, theological, personal leaps, jumps, diving back into the past, weaving together a search for a voice, a sort of a global tour, the weaving together of different selves even, in an attempt to make a sort of whole. And I think in many ways, what I sort of gesture towards is that this sort of rupture and irrecoverable loss is also brings up the possibility of self-fashioning, and self-fashioning without the baggage and perhaps a weight of tradition on our backs as well. I think that another sort of theme that I try and touch upon is to try and overturn the narrative of that loss and of that trauma. You know, there is a displacement of, you know, Black people from Africa to the Caribbean, and then through colonialism, you know, the Windrush and stuff. There's a sort of second displacement, right? You know, to the metropole, effectively. And then there's sort of alienation that sort of takes place with sort of being Black or being Muslim within the West as well. And what I'm sort of arguing is that those conflicts and those traumas, I see them as a place of possibility, as a source of political consciousness and of potentially cosmic consciousness. And there's a small quote from Eric Williams. He was a noted academic, the author of the classic Capitalism and Slavery, and also the first Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago, when he says that the moment, you know, when the enslaved African was put into the ship to be transported across the Atlantic, that moment he became revolutionary. So there is a sort of connection between almost sort of like moral purpose and sort of suffering, if you will. And what I sort of argue is that this consciousness for a Black Muslim opens up a lot of possibilities. You know, the Black Muslim, or at least, you know, there are many different types of Black Muslims, but in my case, you know, we have a sort of a Western Hemisphere, you know, sort of mooring, as well as obviously as Muslims and connected to Africa, we kind of have a sort of, you know, grounding in other parts of the world as well. And just really to end with sort of the different reactions to the piece, it was quite interesting in that everyone interpreted it completely different. I mean, as one would probably expect. I mean, it kind of surprised me at the time, but then coming to think of it, you know, I shouldn't be so surprised. So some people saw it as this sort of like Pan-African manifesto. Some saw it as a sort of you know, as a sort of Sufi sort of, you know, meditation of some sort. Some people also pointed out that that there was also another sort of nuance in that I'm speaking from a francophone country, and speaking about sort of Senghor and the history of Senegal in English was quite unusual. They felt because you know, and you sort of realize this when you're here, that the idea of Africa and of West Africa in particular that you get from living in London is basically Nigeria, it's Ghana, and to a lesser extent it's Sierra Leone, it's Liberia, and the Gambia, right? Places like Senegal, Burkina Faso. I mean, a lot of people don't even know that. I mean, if you said Burkina Faso to people, they'll be asking you, I mean, is that a dish? You know, they don't even know if it's a country. So a lot of these places don't really get a look in. So that was that's been an interesting experience, being in a different, sort of zone from the one I was sort of expected to be in, so to speak. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for that fascinating account. Hassan, would you like to introduce your piece now?
Yes, so my piece was written as the last word to the volume, and it was written after I think most of the essays had been completed, and it was written. My piece was written as a response to the re-explosion of the Black Lives Matter movement globally, and that's what I wanted to kind of relate to write about from my point of view. And the first thing, just to talk about the Black Lives Matter movement or its kind of resurgence, because remember, this is the kind of second wave, if you like, of Black Lives Matter activity and protest and debate. But the explosion around in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd in America, which people will know about, I found it quite extraordinary how fast it traveled globally. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I did. If I opened my essay by listing a whole number of the countries where Black Lives Matter protests happened, and they did happen everywhere, from Iceland to every country in sub-Saharan Africa, to obviously every town and some villages in the UK, to towns and cities in Italy, to every continent there are protests, apart from Antarctica, I'm told. And so that was quite as a global phenomenon, that was quite something. And clearly, every country, although it kind of borrowed from the dynamism of the protests around George Floyd, quickly rooted themselves in whatever injustices were happening, particularly around the question of the police and black and minority ethnic populations in those countries, how quickly it rooted in specifics. So, in this country, there are various protests around various deaths in custody and violence of the police. In other countries, it was the same. And it reminded me of a period I went through as a young journalist in the 1990s, where I was asked to report as part of my job on a whole series of black deaths in custody that happened mostly in London in the 1990s. And most of the names of those people, I think, has been forgotten, or probably people don't even know about their stories. And I say that because one of the impetus for me writing the article was talking to someone who was very agitated about the Black Lives Matter thing, which is great. And I said, and talked about George Floyd, and I said, yes, absolutely right. And I said, and you know about the history of black deaths in custody in this country, in the UK? And he said, no, not really. And I said, well, you need to find out. You need to know about this kind of stuff. And really, this was my impetus, was to retrace, if you like, my memory and my old reporter's notebooks back to the 1990s and retell the stories of some of these people who have been killed in police custody or after violent encounters with the police. One thing I hadn't kind of realised was actually how upsetting it actually was to recall some of those incidents which I reported on, and the realization came to me after I realized that probably about 10 days after the murder of George Floyd, I hadn't actually brought myself to look at the video of the murder of George Floyd taking place. I couldn't actually face it. I don't know how many other people felt the same way, but I really, I kind of knew what it was going to be like, and I couldn't go there. Eventually, of course, I had to, but it did bring back memories of all these cases which I reported on in London. I mean, just to give you an example, the case of Brian Douglas from South London, an African Caribbean young man, a boxer promoter, a very well-liked figure, from a very devout Christian Jamaican family. He goes out celebrating one night with a friend, and he's caught down the alleyway by two policemen, two Metropolitan policemen. A confrontation happens, and there's no account that says that Brian Douglas himself was aggressive in any way, but he ends up being truncheoned by one of the police officers and falls unconscious, is taken to a local police station, is thrown into a cell, is left there for over a day, just lying on the floor of the cell, as gradually he dies because the truncheon blow has fractured his skull, and he's dying from massive hemorrhaging in his brain. So he's lying there in his own mess in the cell, and it's not until he's virtually dead that someone in the police station realizes that maybe they should do something. They take him to hospital, and he's rushed to hospital. He's on emergency support, and he dies shortly afterwards. His mother is on a visit back to Jamaica, and she finds out about what's happened to her son via a phone call, and she has to try and make her way back. She doesn't make her way back in time to actually see her son before they switch off the life support machine. His brothers and sisters and his friends spend many hours trying to find out where the police have actually taken Brian, the unconscious Brian, and eventually they do find out. But obviously they can't get access to him. We know that because he's lying on the floor of a cell for hours upon hours upon hours as his life is kind of ebbing away. And I talk about that, and then I talk about really about how the forces of the state rush in to protect the policeman, which I think if you look at George Floyd, we'll see beginning to play out, or some of the other, Breonna Taylor, for example. That if you follow the case of Breonna Taylor in the US, the woman who was shot in her bed, you find out that the only charges being pressed against the policeman that shot her in her bed is one of the policemen shot into a wall of a surrounding building, and he's being charged with reckless behaviour. But the actual police officers that shot Breonna Taylor in her bed are not being charged with any criminal offence. So the state always began to move into action to protect the police. And what I kind of realised was there was this, and what I saw unfold was this huge unequal battle between a family grieving for a loved one and trying to find out what happened and trying to bring someone to account, and huge forces of the state, lawyers, PR spin people at Scotland Yard, Tory newspapers who had fed tit-bits to try and smear the reputation of the dead person, trying to say, he was violent, or look at his criminal past, and all these kind of things. And really, they didn't. In one sense, they didn't really stand a chance. And you realise, and what I began to realise was that and this happened time and time again throughout the 1990s. And I went from one campaign to another, and you found out even in the UK, where we think we have law and order, that there are actors of the state who act with impunity and who know that they can get away with killing a black person, and they will escape any kind of justice which will be applied to any of us. And in one sense, I wanted to kind of reclaim those stories and those names of those people who were killed. But also, kind of as a Muslim activist, I wanted also to say that there are all these other communities which kind of have similar, kind of travel on similar historical roads to us, although they may not be of our faith, who maybe, it touches on what Amandla saying. Those communities, for example, that Jamaican London community suffers deep trauma and loss and grief that goes back generations and generations. And it seems to me that what modern racism does is it just kind of tears the wound open again, time and time again. And there's a kind of historical continuity there, which I find quite difficult to grasp, actually, kind of depth of pain that exists in some of these communities, and the way in which they found themselves victimized and discriminated against and even killed. But just to end on this, I end on one other example, just to give you an idea about how I was trying to make links, which is an Irish stallholder called Richard O'Brien, who's murdered by South London police outside a community centre where he's been spending the night with his wife and kids. And he's basically suffocated to death. And the last thing he says to the police is, I can't breathe, you're killing me. And of course, that was almost exactly what George Floyd was uttering as he was being suffocated, asphyxiated by the police. And this was an Irish trader. And as the police were killing him, they were throwing all sorts of racist insults to do with his Irish ancestry at him. And yes, I'll end there. But I was trying to capture a part of history, maybe London history, and to try and honour some of these names and these families, to understand that, try and understand the kind of deep grief and trauma that exists in some of these communities, but which are just supposed to go on and pretend that nothing's ever existed, even though all this kind of trauma is hidden within these communities. So that was something that I found very affecting, actually recalling some of these incidents.
Thank you for that very harrowing account. One question I'd like to maybe perhaps begin our discussion with, you mentioned this continuity of a wound that is opened up again and again through this discourse. I was just wondering what approaches or methods there are for addressing that wound, if any, and if the institutions that you're critiquing, if they've sufficiently changed over the last 2-3 decades in any noticeable way, and if personal exploration or if community healing can really address this deep-seated trauma.
I don't think the police in this country have changed at all, to be honest. And why should they? Because none of them were ever brought to account for all these things that they did and continue to do. And I was very interested, actually, is during the COVID lockdown to read accounts of the police moving in on young people in places like Brixton, which are these historic kind of battlegrounds, if you like, between the forces of the state and young black populations in this country. How they were moving to basically break up groups of kids who are out at night, not doing any harm to anyone, but they were just out and about, as they tend to be, because they're young and they're in the middle of a city. They were in the middle of a city, and it seemed to me that was, in any one of those circumstances, something could have happened by which a dead person could have been the result of it. And so it seems to me is that if anything, this continues to happen, but it's a kind of hidden world. And it's only when something like Black Lives Matter opens the whole question up for everyone to see that that these things begin to rise to the surface again. But to be honest, I think it's business as usual. But that's not just London. That's that's all these places where there were Black Lives Matter protests.
Hassan, can I actually just jump in? I know the question was about trauma as it relates to Black Lives Matter, but I do think there's also, as a way of response to trauma, is when I was also just listening to Amandla talking about how he was tracing histories from as far back as slavery. And I thought there's also a way in which through our stories or through stories, we're kind of breaking away some of the silences and the parts of our history that we wouldn't usually have talked about, or even if we wanted to talk about it, we didn't necessarily have certain spaces or access to spaces to say these things. So while I do agree that there is a continuity of trauma, and it's something that a lot of us carry with us from generations to generations, I do also think there is some ways through the fact that there are more spaces to be able to speak. I even just listening to Hassan talking about the explosion of Black Lives Matters even recently. And I think about how social media, for instance, played a role, how COVID itself, maybe just the frustration of all the lockdowns, it was like a tipping point where everyone was just like, maybe now. So I do think there is at least some ways in which silence is no longer as a taboo. There are certain things that we may, even generations, even decades ago, some young people may not have said that we're saying now. Which is also really interesting when listening to Amandla and Hassan, I was also thinking about the location of our stories. So a lot of narratives, for instance, a lot of Windrush narratives, are very centered on London, for instance, or very centered on Jamaicans. But there are different types of Caribbeans and in different parts of the UK. So when I was, for instance, writing my story, I was tracing a migrant from St. Kitts who moved to the Midlands. We rarely hear stories about Caribbeans in Birmingham, in Leeds, and there. Similarly, when Amandla was talking about Francophone and, or at least Senegal writing in English, that also, I just thought that's really interesting how that in a way is reframing narratives and trying different things. And the last thing I also just wanted to say is even from a Nigerian perspective, and I completely agree with you, Amandla, that a lot of West African discourse, first of all, is very Anglophone, and it's very heavily centered on Nigeria and then Ghana. And I giggled when you said Burkina Faso, because we're actually doing research in Burkina Faso at my work. And yes, it is a country where most people are like, where is that? But even within Nigeria and thinking about narratives, it's very Lagos-centric, for instance. And here I am writing about Northern Nigeria. And even nowadays, when we write about Northern Nigeria, there's a very specific focus on Boko Haram and Northeast Nigeria. So there's also, it's not something I thought I was doing when I was writing it, but there's also in telling stories in different locations that you don't typically have these stories about. So I'll just stop there, but it was just really fascinating listening to both of you and finding all the connections and disconnections.
Can I come in? So yeah, thank you very thanks for those comments. On the Northern Nigeria point, I think what you said is absolutely key, and I'm always struck by when someone says, "Oh my gosh, there's been such this explosion of like Nigerian novelists or Nigerian writers." Like about 70% are Igbo and the rest are Yoruba, right? So when you think of Achebe, when you think of Chimamanda, when you think of Soyinka, these are all Southerners, right? And they only really speak for a particular constituency. They don't speak for the entire country, right? And I find that really interesting, that how the North, which I think is probably more populous and is obviously predominantly Muslim, you only actually really get a certain narrative from Nigeria. So even within the UK context, our idea of being Nigerian is often located in the south of Nigeria sometimes, and not really looking at the north, right? So there are even these sort of points of these barriers within certain countries that we just don't really get exposed to as well. So I thought that was a really important point. When you spoke about migrations as well, I'm also struck as well because about the sort of internal African migrations. So what's interesting is I live in Dakar, in the capital of Senegal, but I live in a village, a pre-colonial village within the bounds of Dakar. It was here before the French came, and it's a very traditional place. Like, I mean, it's structured like a village. It has a chief. It has people tend their entire world is basically the village. They sort of revolve. Everything revolves around the village, and there are these sort of communities. If I take a left here, then this is like the Fulani corner. So all these sort of Fulanis from other parts of Africa, like they're there. Over there is the Hausas. Around there are some Guineans as well, right? So I think there are some really interesting stories of like migration within Africa itself, which I think when we always sort of put things as sort of like Africans going to Europe or whatever else, I think that sort of it kind of gets missed as well. On the issue of trauma and repair, one of the things that came up from the BLM movement, which is related to this, is reparations. That was one of the issues that sort of came up, and Caribbean nations have been leading in basically demanding reparations from from colonial powers, and have invested quite a lot of resources, and I'm sure some of you might have seen that. And one of there's a sort of 10-point plan, and one of the points of that plan is there's I think the first point is basically allowing for repatriation. So for a lot of people of African descent, coming back to Africa is seen for them as, and escaping the racism, is for them a sort of homecoming. I mean, it's easier said than done, and I'm sort of evidence of that. But for many people, I mean, even right now, there are people coming from America every week. You'll be surprised. There are people fleeing United States to come to Senegal every week. Seriously, to try and settle here. So this is something that's happening. And so part of the reparation plan of the Caribbean nations is, is for European powers to be funding these sort of repatriations. But there's also another point, which is about them investing in mental health, sort of institutions for people who have suffered, from the legacies of slavery and genocide. Where my family come from, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, I can actually trace my lineage back to a slave owner, Samuel Spann. Samuel Spann was one of the main people in the merchant venturers, which in Bristol, basically the leading sort of slave trading company, which was responsible also for the colonization of North America and stuff like that. And in terms of the trauma, I mean, obviously there are people who went through slavery, who are literally born with this insistence, this idea that they had to, that their entire self-worth was based on them working on basically them giving free labor, right? And I think that leaves very, very, very deep scars in running down the line. But there's also the issue of indigenous people in the Caribbean as well. And I think that gets swept underneath the carpet as well. That in St. Vincent, the British, it was completely genocide. I mean, they completely wiped them out. And some of those that were left, they're called the Garifuna. They were taken to an island just off the coast of St. Vincent, one of the Grenadines. And from there, they were taken to Honduras. And what's really fascinating is that a high percentage of a lot of the Central American migrants fleeing to the United States and seeking asylum in the United States are Garifuna. So you can see this kind of historical sort of cord from genocide in St. Vincent, banishment to the Grenadines, banishment to Honduras, and now these people are now trying to get into the United States. So yeah, there's trauma, but there's also, I think there's also, more material repair as well, I would say as well. Yeah. Sorry if that was a bit long. Yeah.
No, that was very interesting. Hassan, would you like to respond to that?
Well, it just made me think in one sense of the kind of inherent instability in the lives of people who have been pulled from one part of the world to another, because there's all wherever you end up, you always seem to be somehow in transit. I don't know, and I don't quite know what that does to you. Whether maybe it's a liberating thing as well as being something which kind of eats away at you. But the notion of citizenship being conditional, which I think maybe as Muslims we kind of understand in terms of how the state, the sort of security apparatus is and Islamophobia is working out. But this notion of people's citizenship being really conditional, of you not really ever being not accepted, but just part of a society, that somehow there is a force that can that's always there to kind of undermine you. I think about it in terms of, obviously in terms of the Windrush generation, the last group of people I thought who were going to find themselves, their citizenship uprooted and fragmented and taken away from them, and then end up in camps before being deported and so on and so forth. I mean, that kind of lack of belonging of the people who have been pulled from one place to another seems to me also part of our DNA in all sorts of different ways. But when, you know, we're not but also they're also, like you say, the other thing I wanted to say was that that like British society, for example, can only handle one kind of narrative around the question of the Black Atlantic, really, which is kind of now being consolidated into the kind of official Windrush kind of BBC version of history, even though it's been undermined by the present government. But clearly, along those kind of passages, all sorts of people came. I mean, you know, I was thinking when I was reading Zahrah's piece about reggae and the beginnings of reggae in Jamaica. You know, there was a guy called Leslie Kong, who was a Chinese restaurant owner. Actually, was the first guy who recorded Bob Marley and Toots and the Maytals and all those kind of people. You know, the Chinese Caribbean community, for example, who we don't really we talk about. The Lebanese community across the Caribbean, who we don't really talk about either. Various other small groups of kind of renegade Europeans, like the Portuguese, who you find in different parts of the Caribbean. You know, poor even European communities, as it were, historically. And so, you know, I think also as part of the Black Atlantic or the Muslim Atlantic, we also have to acknowledge that there's that the complexity of these roots is also very rich as well. And we shouldn't allow ourselves to be just boxed into one kind of singular retelling of British history, because that's all that the Brits can put up with.
Arsalan, is it okay if I come in? There was actually two things. One thing I remember that Hassan said when he started talking about his essay and talking about how you tracked the different Black Lives Matters movements. And I noted that you said in towns and cities in Italy. And I've, like you said before the call, I've been in Italy now 14, 15 months. And it was really fascinating for me as a Black person who was in the UK to move to Italy and to Florence, where the views of Black people, in particular Africans, is very, not very positive, let's put it that way. And there's also a very specific view around migrants. Yeah. And the experiences I'd already experienced prior to the George Floyd protests, to then find out that Italians were getting involved in protesting, and for instance, the US Embassy in Florence. And it was, I still haven't processed it, if I'm being honest. To know on one hand, Italians were protesting against what was happening in America, but on the other hand, not being aware of what happens day to day in the country. So when you were saying that, it just jogged a memory. And also when you said about lack of belonging just now, and again, being what I would call a migrant in Florence, in Italy, and that experience of being a Black migrant in Europe, when I say Europe, I mean Italy versus being in the UK, is completely different. It's also me trying to navigate that. So it's just really interesting hearing that. And there's something you said, Amandla, around the history in St. Vincent and Grenadine, and also just what we walk around with. And for instance, someone like me, my name is a giveaway. Part of my name is Nesbitt. And you can trace that to the particular plantation owner in Nevis, because my grandfather's family was from Nevis. So there's also that thing where I do walk around every day with a reminder of a certain part of my history. And in the UK, for instance, I've had Scottish people stop and have conversations. And the first question I usually have is, oh, you must be married to a Scottish man. And I typically always want to go, oh, I wish I could sit you down and give you a history lesson right now. But I think there's also that thing about, for some of us, we also carry that history in our names, and it kind of escape us no matter what we do. So that I just wanted to comment on that. I'm really enjoying listening to you both as well. So
yeah. I'm quite interested in Zahrah, what you said about you never met your grandfathers. I met just one of my grandfathers, and he passed away when I was like 7 years old. So I didn't get much time with him, and so my narrative is very much bound up with with women, and sort of their contribution, and it does feel as though the woman's side of my family, it just feels heavier for some reason, as a result of that. So yeah, I just wondered how how that was for you, and what that sort of meant for you as well.
it was, as I said in the beginning, I initially wanted to write about my grandmother because, again, my side is very female.
Right.
And that's naturally a lot of stories I write are about women. That's what I naturally gravitate to. So this in itself was a challenge for me to go completely and write a story centered on men, and stories centered on men that I never met and my parents only knew for a very short period of their time. So for instance, I found out about my grandfathers through my parents, which in itself was really interesting. Speaking to a Nigerian father and asking him questions, that in itself is a very interesting task, because he wanted to know, why am I asking him? Because there's certain things you don't ask, there's certain things you don't talk about. So it was getting him comfortable with me asking him questions about his father. Whereas the reverse, speaking with my mother about her father and the memories she had about him and all the different things she remembered. It was interesting. Her memory of him was a lot clearer, in quote, considering I think he passed away when she was 10 or 11. But for me, it was very hard because I've always had this nostalgic view of what it would be like to have grandfathers and to have additional father figures, around. And a lot of my friends have grandfathers, and you see what their relationship is with them, or at least they had grandfathers for a while. So for me, this was also a way to connect. And I probably created this idealistic version of them that probably isn't the case. And also the fact that if I think about the era and the time they would have been living in. So for instance, my father's father would have been in Nigeria pre-independence. What exactly would that have been like? Similarly, my father's mother would have initially been in Nevis and then St. Kitts. What was it like then? I know that he worked on his grandmother's farm. So clearly he wasn't a wealthy man. So what was that experience like? And then what was that experience coming to the UK? Because a lot of also what Hassan says about the histories, the experience in terms of police brutality. I've sanitized the story because I did it through music, but what did my grandfather actually go through when he moved to the UK? What was it like, him and my grandmother? So it was tough, and there were certain things I deliberately chose not to include. And I think also using music was probably a way to sanitize, in quote, what would have been an even more difficult history. But no, it wasn't easy. And there's still also there's a lot more I didn't include, as is with every story. Yeah. Hopefully I'll be brave enough to tackle those more traumatic aspects.
Yeah. Can I just ask both Hassan and Zahrah and Amandla a question? But before that, just a little short story. We always find it difficult to speak to our fathers for some reasons. I mean, even my children find it difficult to speak to me, which is surprising. But I found it very difficult to speak to my father. He would never ever speak about his own father. And it took me over 20, 30 years to discover why this was so. So my name is Sardar, my surname is Sardar, and my father's surname was Sardar, but the rest of the family is Durrani, because originally we are Durranis. We come from Afghanistan, right? We came probably with the Turkish, joined the Turkish army. My ancestors probably joined the Turkish army and came to India and started speaking Urdu, which is what I speak. But so there was this strange thing that just my father was called Sardar, but all of his brothers were Durrani, his sisters were Durrani, and all of my paternal families were Durrani, are Durranis to this day. And it took me 30 years to discover why this was so, constantly talking to my father, who refused to talk about it. The reason was that when my grandfather was a young man, he joined the British Army and fought in the Boxer Rebellion. And his brothers joined the Indian freedom fighting movement. They joined different movements. So he was regarded as an odd person in the family, right? And most of his brothers did not associate with him. And in fact, he not just joined the British Army, but was deeply attached to the Raj in some ways, right? And therefore, he was quite kind of pro-Raj, if you like, pro-British, while the rest of the family was very, very anti-British. In fact, he fought so bravely in the Boxer Rebellion and in Afghanistan that he was given a knighthood. And in 1932, when he was given the knighthood, you could not give the standard Sir knighthood. You had to give an Indian equivalent. It was called the Indian IMA or something. And I discovered that because there's only one photograph of him standing outside a tent with his sword and all his medals on his chest. And I went to the India House Library and researched all the individual medals, and only then I discovered that he was knighted. And so instead of calling him Sir, they gave him the honor of Sardar. So my father was the only one who identified with it. So he adopted the Sardar. So we became Sardar, while the rest of the family remained Durrani. So I mean, that's a kind of interesting story about how colonial experience has had different impact on all of us, and how fathers and grandfathers are always very difficult to decipher. What I wanted to ask Hassan, what do you think is the future of the Black Lives Movement, particularly if Trump wins the election, which is a possibility? And what I would like to ask Zahrah and TJ is, how do we bring all the diversity that you talk about, all the African diversity to the forefront, right? I mean, being African is not really an identity. It's a continental identity. It doesn't mean anything, right? How do we bring the Yorubas, all the different varieties of ethnicities, wonderful varieties of ethnicities and cultures and traditions that exist in Africa to the forefront?
Okay, so I've shot at it first. Just to carry on from your story, when I first went back to Trinidad, I realised that my family name wasn't Muhammad Ali; it was actually Ali, and that my father had borrowed someone else's passport to get into the UK, and thereby avoid national service, as he would have had to have done. And so it wasn't until I actually went back to Trinidad for the first time I found out that my surname wasn't my name at all. But I think that generation, that early generation of migrants, they reinvented themselves so thoroughly, to be honest, that it's very, very difficult. Part of the reason why they wouldn't talk about their backgrounds is because they invented most of it, actually. They took the opportunity of migration to reinvent themselves away from what they had previously been. And changing a name, I think, was a starting point for a lot of them. And in those days, you could actually, passports didn't really matter very much. You could travel on someone else's passport and no one really notice or care about it. Very different from today. But in terms of the Black Lives Matter movement, It's very difficult to say, isn't it? I mean, I think I think it's not just a broad movement; it's very deep as well. I mean, it's interesting, wasn't it, that over here that it quickly zeroed in on the question of decolonization, Bristol. I mean, it's, in one sense, it's already had an effect, because the whole Bristol incident, the toppling of the statue and the throwing of it into the quayside, and then the renaming of various parts of Bristol away from its original slave names of slave owners, has already altered Bristol. And Bristol, it seems to me, is one of those last kind of outputs, certainly in England, which had refused to come to any kind of terms or talk about its slave past. Even Liverpool, which, you know, had to be dragged and screaming, but even Liverpool has begun to talk about its slave past. But Bristol was kind of the last city, slave port, as it seems to me, that wanted to talk about its past at all. And all that's changed. But part of the Black Lives Matter movement, it seems to me, its future is whether or not it generalizes out into other struggles. So, for example, over here, I know that there's debate amongst the Black Lives Matter activists as to they take a position on Islamophobia or not, or do Black Lives Matter just mean Black Lives Matter, whatever you think black means. And so I think it is something phenomenal that has happened. I think the axis has shifted, and I can't see it shifting back again to pre-explosion days. But I think also the life of the movement depends on how many kind of alliances it makes. This is the history of struggle, for example, in America. It's a question of alliances and who you make alliances with, and what are the basis of those alliances. So that's how I see future conversations going.
Would you like to go first?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, I can sort of add to what Hassan says about Black Lives Matter. I think you make an important point about it needs to think about how it branches out to deal with, you know, other struggles and you know, the definition of what it means to be black. Some of you may have seen that one of the members of Black Lives Matter was, I mean, he was almost virtually forced to display his passport on Twitter to prove that he was black enough to be part of Black Lives Matter. So there are these debates going on about, how extensive is black in terms of Black Lives Matter. But there's also evidently been a sort of backlash as well. You've probably seen that Britain's Got Talent is now the most complained about TV program. You had last week, you had Nabil Abdul Rashid, a Northern Nigerian Muslim, who's also received thousands of complaints for mocking those who have been complaining about Britain's Got Talent. So there's a massive backlash. You read the newspapers and stuff and stuff like that. So we'll sort of see. And I think as well, it's quite easy as well to make it just about police violence and not see the broader, not see a sort of broader scope here as well. Here in Senegal, for example, yeah, there was a Black Lives Matter sort of march, but if Black Lives Matter, then are we thinking about British multinationals that are operating in the African continent, for example, right? Isn't that Black Lives Matter as well? You can't to think about Black Lives Matter within the context of the former metropole, solely, I think is quite limited, and doesn't really speak to the global dimension of it. So what Hassan, you spoke about this global dimension. I'm so interested to see how it all interacts and links up as well. African diversity to the forefront. It's a good question because I've just written about this recently, actually, I guess in some ways, and I interviewed the Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o, who is often tipped for the Nobel Prize. And I'm interested in what you mean by forefront. The sort of reason being is that, and I'll go back to my examples from southern Nigeria, Chimamanda and Achebe and Soyinka. there is this idea that, a lot of these writers have sort of launched African literature, or they've made African writing or whatever go global. But at the same time, they are writing in English, right? And that's an inherent tension, right? English is not an indigenous language, to Africa. Some might argue it is, and that's, Chimamanda has her views on that. And so there's always a question about this idea of kind of writing back, right? About representation, about, showing that we are like this or showing that we are like that. And that's something that we need to think about as well. Like, some of these writers, are being published by like the likes of Penguin or Random House. They've been able to become bestsellers, Sunday Times bestsellers, New York Times bestsellers. But yet, Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart, right, hasn't been translated into Igbo, which is a language, is Achebe's indigenous, local language, right? So these things have to be weighed up, and I think the conversation has to sort of take into account the Western gaze, and also the sort of the Western circulation and how that affects what African culture is and how it expresses itself, compared to what happens here in the village, for example, right? I go out in the village and maybe I'll leave this meeting and there'll be exorcism taking place, outside in the village. That happens sometimes, right? But that and in many ways, people here in this village, hardly anyone speaks French, right? So they speak Wolof, and in fact they have their own dialect of Wolof. They have their own particular dialect of Wolof. So they've managed to preserve something as well. So yeah. So I just thought I'll say that just to sort of throw that in there, into the question.
I'm actually going to pick up from what you're saying, Amandla, because when you were speaking, this is also in response to how do we bring the diversity in the African continent at the forefront. And I actually wrote down language when I heard the question, because the fact is our continent is so diverse. There is language diversity. I mean, already between us is Anglophone and a Francophone, but we haven't even gotten to like Lusophone Africa, if you then start thinking about the Portuguese. Also, when you were mentioning earlier, Amandla, about, for instance, in Nigeria, our literature is very dominated by the South. In the northern part of Nigeria, a lot of writing and everything is in Hausa. Yeah. So there's a lot of production of literature, of movies, of music in Hausa. So then that already, in a way is limiting, but I don't use the word limiting. It means that there's just not English translation, but it does exist. So there's also those barriers that exist. Also, when you mentioned about Chimamanda saying English itself could be indigenous, there's also a lot of discussions around Nigerian English being a particular language in itself. And I just thought that is also the way in which, and I'm assuming French in Senegal probably has some sort of localness into it. So I think there's also a way in which within the continent we've probably added our own flavor into European languages. In terms of how we can bring all the diversity, one thing I was thinking about is, and just building up on the literature angle or the literature focus, is there's also been a shift to there being, for instance, African publishing houses. So it's not only necessarily writers writing for the West or to be published in the West. There's also the reverse, where there are local publishing houses that are coming up to be able to make books in a way a bit more, quote, affordable, or also to maybe also have different languages there. I would say another way to bring in the diversity is to acknowledge the fact that, to borrow an annoying stereotype, that Africa is not a country. It is actually huge. And the second we start, and also Africa is not Nigeria or South Africa, or maybe if we want to say Kenya, there also seems to be within each African region a specific country that we tack on to sort of speak for them. So in Southern Africa, we focus a lot on South Africa. I'm imagining Lusophone Africa is probably a lot of Angolan focus versus others. So I think it's also beginning to be more open about the diversity that exists within the continent. And also our connections with the diaspora, because there's also that. That's another way. But also I would say without African voices in the West overpowering the actual voices of Africans that are living in the individual countries and experiencing it, because my experience as a Nigerian who is now in Italy cannot necessarily speak to the experience of a Nigerian that is in Nigeria. And I just wanted to end on what Hassan mentioned about Black Lives Matter branching out. So for instance, like in Nigeria, over the weekend and recently, there has been these movements around ending SARS, which is what's a special anti-robbery squad. And I do think in some instances, there has been probably some inspiration taken from what is being seen happening around the Black Lives Matters movement, but obviously translated to a local context, the Nigerian context within the language. So, and it does, I agree with Amandla, it is still touching on police brutality because NSARS is focusing on that. But they've also recently branched out, because now I've noticed on social media, they're now adding hashtags around end bad governance. So also in a way trying to branch out the conversation. So, but there is a question about sustainability and what will happen and how will this manifest into, I don't know, a different dimension, but I guess we have to continue observing. So yeah.
Thank you. The conversation is fascinating. It's taking on so many different shapes. We have about 15 or 20 minutes just for a general Q&A. So if anyone has had a question and they want to jump in. Yep, Abraham. I think you might be muted.
No.
Still muted.
You're not muted, but we can't hear you.
No?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been a very interesting experience for me to attend this. I'm calling in from Lahore, Pakistan, and listening to Amandla. It's so interesting actually because I remember my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, apparently decided to move to Mauritania, which is next door to you, in the 1960s. And we've always wondered in the family why, because there's so many people who went to Kenya and all these other places who went to the UK, and they're the second, third generation Pakistani and Indian families from the British Empire that are now available to us across the globe. That my grandfather and a lot of other people decided to move away from the connections from the British Empire. So following up on that and what Hassan had mentioned about Lebanese Caribbean people existing and Chinese Caribbean people existing. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this other sort of diversity around Indians being present amongst people in Senegal or Nigeria or any of the other places that you can, Trinidad, for example, can talk to about. And I had a second question. I was really intrigued, if I'm not mistaken, that both Zahrah and Amandla have a sort of slave owner connection. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit more about that. How does that work, and what are the power dynamics that are available to people in your community? Is that something that people think about really for people who are African and were slave owners and those who were slaves themselves? Thank you.
Hassan, you're an expert on Indians in the Caribbean.
Indians in the Caribbean.
You've elected yourself.
Oh gosh. Well, to actually, there's a wider, yes. I mean, there are lots of Indians on various islands in the Caribbean, mostly, and other places like Mauritius, and you always wonder how did they end up there? Is always the first question, isn't it? South America, etc., etc. But basically, that's to do with economic migration after the end of slavery, when basically the liberated slaves decided they wouldn't work for the ex-slave owners and deserted the plantations, quite rightly. And therefore the plantation owners had to bring in indentured labour, which is where you get the Indian populations. But there's a more, I think there's a more wider point really, which is, I mean, I only really know about Trinidad in terms of its first hand, but how diverse the islands of the Caribbean are. They're kind of like they're kind of like a kind of nexus, a migration nexus, and the different groups which exist in those islands. It's quite interesting to see how they relate to one another. So, for example, on a formal level in Trinidad, you have the two biggest groups are those descended from those from Indian descent and those from African descent. They make up maybe 40% of the population each, and then there's other groups in between. So therefore, they're the two biggest groups, and they're represented historically by basically a party which organizes and speaks to the Indians, another party that organizes and speaks to the Africans. That's traditionally the case. But underneath that, I don't know whether Amanda you want to come in, is that when you get down to the kind of micro level in places like Trinidad, where there is so many different people from so many different places, there is a kind of what I think Paul Gilroy would talk about, which is convivencia, a kind of getting along with one another, which expresses itself in a kind of codes of mutual respect, but also a kind of coming together musically. So, you know, when you talk about Trinidad, it has all sorts of weird and wonderful cross-fertilizations of popular music. You know, of course you have calypso, you have soca calypso, you also have kaiso, you have chutney, you have, which is an Indian-based version of soca, you have parang, which comes from Venezuela, and it's, so those islands, although kind of everyone kind of got pulled to those islands for various reasons, or pushed or taken or kidnapped or sent to those islands, something quite extraordinary does happen in those islands, a kind of micro kind of ecology of what I would call, and what Paul Gilroy calls convivencia. So that makes those islands for me a much more interesting place than maybe the kind of dominant narratives that come from the UK in terms of how we look at the Caribbean, for example.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case, and very interesting. When I was in Trinidad, I mean, I go sort of every year, but I was there like 2 years ago, and it's quite remarkable. You know, I sort of saw like a river and sort of flowers sort of floating down the river, which you know, had come from like a Hindu temple. Then you see a mosque there. Then you'll see like an Ethiopian Orthodox temple there. Then you'll see like a Venezuelan woman buying from a Syrian kebab shop. And then, you know, and you can literally go to different villages, and they have their own peculiar histories. That, you know, this was where indigenous people, you know, mounted a rebellion, and then, you know, Africans were shifted to this place as well, so they kind of intermarried, and so they look like this, and then you go over there. It's an incredibly diverse place, and I think that in general, I mean, when it comes to the New World in general, if we can call it that, you know, there's so much there that sort of defies our sort of categories. You know, for example, Syrians across the Caribbean and South America and Central America. I mean, incredibly influential. I mean, they've been probably about a dozen heads of state or heads of government who've been Syrian. I mean, you look at Edward Siaga in Jamaica. There's Menaim, which was his Arabic name, of Argentina, Syrian heritage. In Chile, Chile has the largest, I think it has the largest has a larger Palestinian population in Chile than there is in Palestine. Don't quote me on that, but sorry, a larger Christian Palestinian population in Chile than there is in Palestine, right? I mean, that, you know, that's a completely different, you know, sort of dimension there. To sort of segue onto the whole slave owner connection. So, I mean, I have various So on one side of my family, I have a Costa Rican ancestor, and then there's this this guy Spann, Samuel Spann, who's also on my mum's side. On my dad's side, there's a Scottish guy there, and it was quite. When I went to my grandmother's funeral, you know, this is sort of where you get these stories and you meet these sort of people. It tends to happen. I was struck by how seemingly Scottish some of my family looked. It was, you know, it was really striking. But I think within the Caribbean context, I mean, it's a bit par for the course, actually. You know, it's not something that you know, that people are, you know, necessarily like, you know, trying to hide or, you know, trying to suppress as such. I mean, in some cases it becomes a reference point, doesn't it? Because sometimes you don't really know who your ancestors are. So if you have one that's Scottish and you know his name, you have one that's English and you know his name, that becomes a kind of reference point, actually, and something to hold on to in quite a sort of perverse way. But that is the sort of truth to it. You don't really have anything to sort of compare that to. I don't know how you think about that, Zahrah. In the case of sort of Spann, this Bristolian guy, it was quite interesting because where we come from in the Caribbean, my mum's side, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, we come from a small island that has just 3,000 people living there. And the two main settlements are named after places in Bristol, so Clifton and Ashton. And so Spann had basically named these places. And then later on in my life, I lived in Clifton. I went to University of Bristol, which was built on the proceeds from slavery. And I lived in Clifton in Bristol. So these connections are just kind of, you know, all around us, and that's just it's kind of a product of kind of who we are. And I think Hassan touched on a point, and this is a point Gilroy sort of emphasizes that, and Edouard Glissant as well, that I think Caribbean identities are definitely, you know, hybrid identities. You know, we're you know, as much as we're Black and we're African, we're also detribalized, and so we don't, you know, Zahrah, maybe you don't, you have that connection, but you know, we kind of don't have always a specific sort of route to a particular place in Africa, and so there's more of an admittance of that diversity, that hybridity that we're all apart from, and that includes European, it includes Indigenous, it includes Indian, it includes Black, you know, all sort of mixed together. So yeah, I'll end with that.
I was nodding to every single thing you said, Amandla, because you pretty much just answered it the way I would. But I will actually just build up on what you said about detribalized, because for me, I kind of function in I have two ways of thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
I have the Nigerian way of thinking, and I know exactly how, as Nigerians, for the most part, we don't even talk about our history per se. So there's that, and we're very tribalized. There is about, you know, and is as much as possible, it's as in quotes, as pure as you can. Are you 100% Nigerian? Are you 100%, for instance, Hausa? So there's that part. And then there's the other part, which is my mother's part, which, similar to when you were talking about your ancestry, my uncle is sort of like our go-to for our family history, because because that's my mother's brother, does family trees, knows all of that. But there's Portuguese on my mother's side. There's all these different things. You can tell that you can tell that my mother's family, they are a product of European influence somehow. You can just tell, versus my African side, you can tell we're African. Not to be rude. So there's that as well. And so from my mother's side, there's a lot of history around slavery. Has never been a taboo topic. You know about it, we speak about it. It's part of who we are. We know about the plantations. We know everything about our history. Whereas on the Nigerian side, it's been more of a learning through reading and trying to understand that aspect. And then when you also think about the northern part, which is probably less transatlantic and more trans-Saharan, and then also having to get that kind of image. So for me, I sort of live with an awareness of all the different parts. I don't see it as a dynamic. It's just, which is why when Amandla was saying about Caribbean identities are a hybrid, I was like, that makes so much sense. It's not confusing. It's not something that I question. It just is what it is. But I imagine if you were to ask this question to someone maybe who is completely Nigerian, their response might be completely different because of maybe that separation from a certain part of history, which is also part of our Nigerian history. So I'll stop there.
I can't hear you.
Thank you for that. We might have time for one last question. If anyone has a question they'd like to ask.
Yeah. Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Are we missing people like Muhammad Ali, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King? And if we are, which approach would have been the right one in the current environment, if any?
That's a question for Hassan.
Oh, I don't know. Look, what can one say? All I can say is that I see, actually, in terms of those figures from American radical history, I don't see them as being separate. I see them part of a continuation of a conversation about liberation. So I know people like to pit Malcolm X against Martin Luther King, but actually, if you study the history of those two men and their ideas and the evolution of their ideas, you find them much closer together than they are far apart. But I mean, I think that's how that's how we're taught history of civil rights in America. We're taught it through these kind of imagined, defined, mythologized, separated figures, where I see it as much more of a continuum than a separate people leading at separate times. What can I say? That's what I can say.
Yeah. Zahrah, do you want to? I've just written a book on Stokely Carmichael, aka Kwame Ture, who was the third member of the sort of triumvirate of the 1960s civil rights Black Power movement. And I mean, one of the things that's interesting actually is that when you sort of dig down, okay, what Hassan said was excellent, because you realise that Stokely Carmichael is a close friend of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
But then he becomes, through his sort of Black Power, Black separatism even, he becomes like even more reviled than Malcolm X. But yet he is a close friend of Martin Luther King. And then at the end of Martin Luther King's life, Stokely encourages King to sort of take a more sort of radical sort of edge towards Vietnam, right? So there's so much complexity with these figures, and I think as well, what I've realized is that you really have to sort of there's still a lot of work to do to dig down deeper and to discover how relevant these figures are to our time. I mean, Malcolm X's autobiography, I mean, it's a great book, but and I think it does help to mythologize him as this person who was just like, for for sort of self-defense, for violence and all that. But when you look behind the book and you look at Alex Haley, who wrote the book and stuff like that, there are a lot of questions that come up, and when you dig deeper, you realize he was a much more complex figure than someone you can put in as a sort of dichotomy with Martin Luther King. I don't know if that answers your question. It probably doesn't. I think just one further point. One of the interesting things about the 1960s compared to now, is about the structure of these movements. When you look at Black Lives Matter, their sort of philosophy is to sort of have a sort of horizontal sort of movement, where we don't have these sort of great figures, these iconic figures who sort of lead the flock, basically. So they're kind of horizontal. There's more of an emphasis on sort of equality, sort of across the board. and that's and I think that's good in some ways, but it can make it quite diffuse and can make things sort of less clear as to what direction we're sort of heading in. So that I think that's part of the reason why there isn't this emphasis on certain individuals as leading these movements today as they were before. That's my take on it. I don't know.
I think at this point we're running at the very end of the session, but I'd like to thank all of you for a very engaging and dynamic conversation. A lot of questions, a lot to think about. Thank you for your time. And just to let everyone know, we've recorded this talk and we'll be sharing it also.
Good. Excellent discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Brilliant discussion. Thank you so much, everyone. It was very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.